The sterile, white corridors of the human research station gleamed under artificial lighting as Dr. Ethan Vance stepped out of the shower, vigorously drying his hair. The station's water recycler had been acting up lately, so he had to settle for a 2-minute rinse, barely enough to scrub off the grime from a long day of dealing with alien dignitaries. He sighed as he pulled his jumpsuit halfway up his torso, fumbling with the zipper. The last thing he needed was another meeting with the Zilkar. The species was fascinating, sure, but their complete lack of external sexual characteristics made explaining human biology awkward. As he adjusted his waistband, the doors to his quarters slid open with a soft hiss. Ethan Vance of Sol 3, we must urgently. Oich stellar void. IT moves. Ethan barely had time to process the words before a high-pitched screech echoed down the corridor. He looked up, startled, and locked eyes with Ambassador Vrelek, a senior Zilkar official whose skin shimmered with iridescent blue hues. What the hell? A clawed hand pointed directly at Ethan's lower half, specifically at the very thing he was in the middle of adjusting. Vrelek stumbled backward, her usually dignified posture giving way to what could only be described as outright panic. She activated a holographic communicator embedded in her wrist, speaking rapid bursts of Zilkaris. Medical emergency. The human Ethan Vance is infested with a self-moving parasite. Immediate quarantine required. What? No. Ethan took a step forward, but the ambassador recoiled in terror. Before he could explain, alarm klaxons blared through the station. Automated security systems sealed the bulkheads. The station's AI chimed in with a calm but firm tone. Attention. Quarantine Protocol Alpha has been initiated. Ethan groaned. Oh, for foo. The doors slammed shut. The alarm klaxons blared through the station, their shrill wail echoing down the sterile corridors. Ethan Vance, still standing in his quarters, half-dressed and utterly bewildered, could do nothing but stare at the sealed door in exasperation. This is a misunderstanding, he shouted, pounding on the bulkhead. The station's AI, Vera, chimed in with its usual infuriatingly calm tone. Quarantine protocols are in effect. Please remain in your quarters, Dr. Vance, until medical personnel arrive. Medical personnel? For what? My anatomy is normal. Ethan groaned, running a hand down his face. Meanwhile, on the other side of the door, chaos was unfolding. Galactic crisis courtesy of human anatomy. Ambassador Vrelek's holographic transmission had reached the Zilkar diplomatic vessel orbiting the station. The emergency report was met with absolute panic. Within moments, a dozen Zilkar dignitaries and scientists had gathered in their command center, watching a grainy security feed of Ethan standing in his room, now pacing in frustration. By the cosmic stream, one of the scientists whispered in horror. It's still moving. Vrelek, still shaken, pressed a trembling clawed hand to her face. This infestation, it must be painful for him. The parasite appears to have full control of its host. Another Zilkar, a pale green one named Exorlon, analyzed the footage. It's sentient. I swear I saw it twitch when he reacted. What kind of eldritch horror have we discovered? I knew the humans were too biologically unstable to be trusted, grumbled one of the more xenophobic diplomats. They bring their corruption into our pristine galaxy. The conversation was quickly spiraling out of control. Some Zilkar were already debating whether humans should be placed under an immediate travel ban, while others wanted to study the parasite for potential biological threats. The most radical among them whispered of drastic measures, quarantining all human males until the parasite could be eradicated. The humans try and fail to fix it. Back on the station, Captain Elise Carter, commander of the human delegation, was rapidly trying to salvage the situation. She sat at the central diplomatic table, pinching the bridge of her nose as the Zilkar delegation demanded immediate action. We need to act now, Captain Carter, Vrelek insisted, her voice laced with urgency. Your species is suffering from an invasive, self-moving parasite. If we do nothing, it could spread. Carter resisted the urge to slam her head against the table. I assure you, nothing is spreading. This is not a parasite. It's called an external reproductive organ. Silence. The Zilkar delegation exchanged horrified glances. Finally, Exorlan spoke up, hesitant. You mean, this is normal? Yes, Carter said through gritted teeth. For all human males? Yes. And it moves? Carter opened her mouth, then immediately decided she was not about to explain involuntary muscle contractions to a species that had none. Sometimes, another Zilkar fainted on the spot. The situation escalates. As Carter struggled to control the conversation, the humans aboard the station started receiving distressing reports from Earth. The Zilkar had already contacted the Galactic Council, requesting an emergency meeting on human biological abnormalities. Even worse, rumors were spreading among other alien species. Some feared humans were harboring dangerous parasites, while others believed they were some kind of engineered horror race. The worst rumor by far? That human males were secretly symbiotic creatures, with two independently sentient beings cohabiting a single body. By the time Carter managed to convince the Zilkar to hold off on official quarantine measures, a new problem had arisen. The Zilkar wanted proof. Time for a terrible science lesson. Hours later, Ethan sat in the station's medical bay, wearing a hospital gown and rubbing his temples. Across from him sat a team of Zilkar biologists, all watching him with a mixture of fascination and deep, cosmic horror. A holographic display of human anatomy floated in the air between them. Dr. Helena Park, the station's lead human biologist, was doing her best to explain human reproduction. It was not going well. So you see, male humans possess an external reproductive structure, which is part of a complex reproductive system shared with female humans. The Zilkar, wide-eyed, nodded. One hesitantly raised a hand. Dr. Park, does this organ detach? Ethan choked on his own saliva. No, Park exclaimed, horrified. Then, what is its purpose? Exorlan asked. It seems inefficiently placed. Exposed. Why would evolution allow such a thing? Ethan sighed. Look, I don't know why nature does half the things it does. Okay? It just is. The Zilkar all murmured to one another in hushed tones, still deeply unsettled. Finally, Vrelek hesitated before asking the question that had been on all their minds. And what of the movements? Ethan really didn't want to answer that. He began. But before he could finish, the Zilkar scientist next to him leaned in, inspecting him with eerie intensity. Is it moving now? A long, painful silence. Ethan groaned, running a hand down his face. Oh my God! Can we please change the subject? Ethan Vance sat in the station's medical bay, rubbing his temples as the Zilkar scientists continued staring at him as if he were some grotesque, cosmic anomaly. The holographic human anatomy display flickered in the air, projecting a perfectly detailed diagram of human reproductive organs. It had been nearly 20 minutes since Dr. Helena Park began her lecture, but from the way the Zilkar were reacting, she might as well have been describing the horrors of an ancient war crime. So, as I was saying, Dr. Park continued, adjusting her glasses, human males and females possess distinct but complementary reproductive systems. The male reproductive organ, which you mistakenly identified as a parasite, is essential for genetic reproduction. Silence. The Zilkar delegation, seated across the room, were all completely rigid. Their skin, normally shimmering with bioluminescent fluid patterns, had dulled into a uniform, horrified gray. Vrelek, still recovering from the initial shock of the parasite revelation, cautiously raised a clawed hand. Dr. Park, forgive my ignorance, but how does this work in practice? Ethan stiffened. Oh, hell no. Dr. Park shot him a warning look before turning back to the aliens. I assume you're asking about human reproduction? Vrelek hesitated, glancing at her colleagues, all of whom looked equally mortified but unable to look away. Yes, Dr. Park sighed and pulled up another diagram. All right, let's go over this carefully. Ethan put his head in his hands. This was going to be a nightmare. The horror unfolds. As the presentation continued, the Zilkar delegation's expressions ranged from cautious curiosity to outright existential dread. They listened as Park explained the mechanics of mammalian reproduction, covering everything from fertilization to fetal development. The moment she mentioned childbirth, however, everything fell apart. And after approximately 9 months, the fetus grows large enough that it must exit the body through. It must what? Exorlon shrieked, bolting upright so fast he knocked over a nearby medical scanner. Several Zilkar recoiled in horror. One clutched their chest, gasping as if they had just learned the meaning of pain itself. Another simply fainted, slumping to the floor in a limp heap. Vrilek, her bioluminescence flickering erratically, looked like she was about to collapse. You mean to tell me a fully formed organism is grown inside of the human body, and then it is expelled? Through a biological cavity. Dr. Park nodded. That is correct. Exorlon made a strangled, gurgling sound, barely able to process what he had just heard. That is madness, another Zilkar muttered. How does your species survive such horrors? How does this not kill you? Ethan sighed. Sometimes it does kill us. But we have medicine. And, human women are ridiculously tough. A long, painful silence. Then, Vrilek whispered. Your species is cursed. Theories begin to spiral. By now, the Zilkar delegation was barely holding itself together. Some had gone completely still, their minds likely shattered by the sheer nightmare fuel of human reproduction. Others were whispering in hushed, fearful voices. We believed their parasite was the abomination. But perhaps their entire species is an abomination. This level of biological insanity should not be possible under natural evolution. What if humans were not naturally evolved at all? What if they were engineered? Dr. Park and Captain Carter both groaned in unison. Oh no, Carter muttered. Not that humans are an ancient bioweapon theory again. Ethan threw his hands in the air. I knew this was going to happen, but it was too late. The Zilkar had already spiraled into full-blown conspiracy mode. We must consult the Galactic Council, Exorlon declared. If humanity was created by an unknown precursor race, then we must understand why, and whether they pose a threat to the balance of the galaxy. Ethan's jaw dropped. A threat? We're the ones who just told you we nearly die bringing our kids into the world. Vrilek turned to Carter with a look of grim determination. Captain, until this mystery is resolved, we must conduct further studies on human physiology. There is too much we do not understand. Ethan narrowed his eyes. I swear, if any of you try to study me while I sleep, I will personally cause a diplomatic incident. A compromise, sort of. After another hour of intense negotiations and a lot of frustrated shouting from Ethan, a compromise was reached. The Zilkar would not request a human quarantine yet, but they demanded access to human medical research, genetic studies, and a live demonstration of childbirth via recorded footage. Fine, Captain Carter said through gritted teeth, but only under strict supervision. The Zilkar, though still visibly disturbed, nodded in agreement. As the meeting adjourned, Ethan leaned over to Dr. Park and whispered, Next time, you get to explain puberty. She paled. Absolutely not. As the Zilkar delegation filed out, murmuring among themselves about the mysteries of humanity, Exorlon hesitated at the door. He glanced back at Ethan, his expression unreadable. Dr. Vance. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Yeah. Does the parasite have a mind of its own? Ethan nearly threw a chair. Ethan Vance had never wanted to throw himself out of an airlock more than he did right now. The Zilkar, still reeling from their biology lesson, had spent the last 2 hours whispering frantically to one another in their warbling, chittering language. Every so often, one of them would steal a horrified glance at him, then quickly look away as if prolonged exposure to his cursed anatomy might give them some kind of psychic trauma. Captain Carter sat at the head of the negotiation table, arms crossed, clearly as exhausted as Ethan. All right, she said, rubbing her temples. Let's recap the situation. You, she gestured to the Zilkar, now understand that human reproductive organs are not parasitic creatures. You also understand that childbirth, while horrifying to you, is a natural part of our species' biology. correct? Vrelek nodded stiffly. Yes. And yet, Carter continued, her patience wearing dangerously thin, you're still convinced that humans are some kind of evolutionary abomination? Exorlan, still visibly disturbed, hesitated before speaking. It is not simply that your species is disturbing. It is the implications of your biology. Ethan groaned. Oh, for the love of… What now? Vrelek straightened, her expression unreadable. Dr. Vance, your species is unique in ways we struggle to comprehend. Your resilience, your adaptability, and now your ability to survive an internal gestation process that would kill most other species. It is all too much. Exorlan nodded. We fear that if you humans are not the product of natural evolution, then you may have been engineered by some forgotten precursor race. And if you were engineered for a purpose, we must ask, what was that purpose? Ethan's eye twitched. I don't know, Exorlan. Maybe we were engineered to survive ridiculous diplomatic meetings where an entire species debates whether my junk is a cosmic horror. Captain Carter held up a hand before Ethan could continue. All right, enough, she sighed. I understand that humanity is different, but different doesn't mean dangerous. That remains to be seen, Vrelek said, folding her clawed hands. You must understand, Captain, that the Zilkar have existed for millennia in a state of biological stability. We are genetically uniform, our physiology optimized for efficiency. We do not suffer from mutations, genetic anomalies, or unpredictable biological functions. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Wait, no mutations? No anomalies? No biological variation at all? Correct, Exorlan said proudly. Ethan exchanged a look with Dr. Park, who looked just as baffled as he did. That's not how evolution works, she muttered. Carter's gaze hardened. So what you're saying is you've been stagnant. Vrelek bristled. We have been stable. No, you've been stagnant, Ethan said bluntly. You've removed variation, which means you've removed change. Meanwhile, humanity? We adapt. We get stronger. We survive. He leaned back in his chair. And maybe that's what scares you. Silence. The Zilkar didn't respond immediately, but the tension in the air was palpable. Ethan could practically see the gears turning in their heads. Then, after a long pause, Exorlan said, Prove it. Ethan blinked. What? You claim your species is superior in its ability to adapt. Exorlan's bioluminescence flickered in challenge. Then we propose a test. A survival challenge. You and a Zilkar representative will be placed in a controlled environment with unpredictable variables. The first to withdraw or succumb to exhaustion will prove their species the weaker. Ethan snorted. You do realize you're challenging a human to an endurance test, right? We are aware. Exorlan's mandibles twitched in what might have been the Zilkar equivalent of a smirk. Do you accept? Carter exhaled sharply. Ethan. Oh, hell yes, Ethan interrupted, grinning. Let's do this. The survival challenge begins. The challenge was simple. Survive for 48 hours on Corva 7, an uninhabited, hostile planet with volatile weather patterns. Both Ethan and Exorlan were given basic supplies. A survival suit, a ration pack, and a knife, and then dropped onto the planet's surface. Ethan had barely hit the ground before he was already strategizing. The first thing he noticed was the temperature. Hot as hell during the day, probably freezing at night. That meant shelter was priority one. Exorlan, however, was taking a very different approach. The Zilkar, with their biologically optimized bodies, relied on efficiency. Exorlan immediately began constructing a perfectly stable shelter using energy-based tools integrated into his suit. It was precise, calculated. Ethan grabbed a bunch of large leaves and built a makeshift sunshade out of instinct. It wasn't pretty, but it worked. Hours passed. Then night came. Ethan had already anticipated the drop in temperature and had built a small, insulated burrow using natural materials. He stayed warm with body heat and layered plant fibers. Exorlan, however, was struggling. His suit's temperature regulation systems had malfunctioned, and without any survival instincts, he had no idea how to generate heat naturally. By the next morning, Exorlan was visibly exhausted. Ethan, meanwhile, had found edible plants. He walked over to the Zilkar's increasingly deteriorating shelter and squatted down. "How's it going, buddy?" he asked, popping a nutrient-rich fruit into his mouth. Exorlan scowled. "Your biology is absurd." Ethan grinned. "You sure you don't want to tap out?" A long silence. Then, with visible reluctance, Exorlan muttered, "I yield." The aftermath. The Zilkar delegation was stunned when Ethan and Exorlan returned. Exorlan, ever the scientist, begrudgingly admitted that humans had an unparalleled ability to survive and adapt to changing conditions. Vrilek, still processing the results, looked at Ethan with newfound respect. "Your species may not be an abomination after all." Ethan smirked. "Gee, thanks," Exorlan sighed. "We may have misjudged you, Dr. Vance." Ethan grinned. "Damn right you did." After the grueling survival challenge on Corva 7, the Zilkar delegation had been left stunned. Not only had Ethan Vance proven that humans could adapt in the most extreme of environments, but he had also demonstrated a core truth about humanity that the Zilkar had failed to grasp. We were a species defined by creativity and resilience, not merely survival. The victory, however, wasn't the end of the diplomatic turmoil. Despite Exorlan's grudging respect, the Zilkar were still deeply unsettled. Their biology, rigid and efficient, seemed like the product of perfection, while humanity's unpredictable, chaotic physiology made them question whether humans truly belonged in the greater galactic order. Back aboard the station, Ethan found himself summoned once again to a tense meeting with Vrilek and the rest of the Zilkar delegation. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, and even Captain Carter's usual stoicism seemed worn thin. "So what now?" Ethan asked as he took his seat, his tone still carrying a hint of his recent victory. Vrilek's luminescent skin flickered in a pattern that suggested deep contemplation, but her words were carefully measured. "You've demonstrated that human survival instincts are formidable." She glanced toward Exorlan, who gave a reluctant nod. "But that does not explain the true nature of your species." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What are you getting at, Vrilek?" Exorlan leaned forward, his voice tinged with both caution and curiosity. "The question still stands, why do humans survive in the way they do? Is it simply a matter of biology? Or is there something deeper at play?" Captain Carter frowned. "What are you suggesting, Exorlan?" The Zilkar scientist seemed to ponder his words carefully. "We've seen your adaptability in action. But what drives it? Your species constantly evolves, not just physically, but socially, culturally, and intellectually. Every challenge you face, no matter how insurmountable, becomes an opportunity. An opportunity to grow, to change." He paused, his mandibles twitching. "Is this truly natural? Or is there an unseen force at work within humanity?" Ethan's patience was wearing thin. "What, you think we're secretly the result of some galactic conspiracy?" Vrilek held up a claw, stopping the conversation from spiraling further. "Let us not jump to conclusions, Dr. Vance. The Zilkar are simply trying to understand what makes your species unique. After all, no other civilization has the kind of spirit that humans do." She almost seemed to be grappling with the words. "We have been forced to reconsider our perception of your species." Ethan leaned back in his chair, suddenly thoughtful. "So, you do admit there's something different about humans?" He looked at Carter, who nodded in acknowledgement. "The fact that we've made it this far, without being wiped out by natural disasters, war, or disease, that says something about humanity. We've had our dark moments. Sure. But in the end, we always find a way to move forward." Exorlan's gaze softened ever so slightly. "That is true. Your species possesses an unusual resilience. But it's more than just survival," Ethan said, his voice dropping into a more contemplative tone. "It's about change. Humans adapt because they don't just react to the world, they shape it. They think outside the box, they break their own rules, and they build things no one ever thought possible." Vrilek blinked, clearly intrigued by this concept. "You claim that your species shapes the world around them?" Ethan nodded. "We don't just adapt to our environment. We change it to suit our needs. That's why we don't stagnate. Evolution is slow, but our creativity is limitless. We turn problems into possibilities. There was a long silence as the Zilkar processed his words. The implications were heavy, unsettling. Finally, Exorlan spoke up again, quieter this time. Then you're suggesting that this creativity, this spirit, is your species' greatest strength? Ethan smiled, but there was a quiet confidence in his expression now. Yeah. And that's something no one else in the galaxy has truly figured out. He looked around the room at the Zilkar. You think we're chaotic, but what if chaos is our order? What if humanity's greatest strength is that we embrace the unknown, the unpredictable, and find a way to make it work? The words hung in the air for a moment, the weight of the idea settling into the minds of the Zilkar. There was something profoundly alien to them about this concept. For a species as rigid and controlled as the Zilkar, the idea of thriving in the face of the unknown was incomprehensible. They had evolved to perfection, yes, but at what cost? Vrelek leaned back in her seat, clearly deep in thought. If this is truly the nature of your species, Dr. Vance, then perhaps we have been wrong in our judgment. Wrong about us? Ethan repeated, a smirk creeping onto his face. Well, that's a first. Glad to hear it. Exorlan's mandibles twitched in what might have been an expression of discomfort, or maybe it was admiration. You humans do defy all expectations. We can't deny that. Ethan raised his hands. Look, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. But when things get rough, we dig in and keep pushing forward. We never stop learning. The Zilkar take a step back. The conversation shifted, no longer focused on human anatomy or odd biological quirks. Now, the Zilkar seemed to be grappling with something much deeper, the very nature of humanity itself. The diplomatic tensions of the past few days seemed to ebb, replaced by a tentative curiosity. Vrelek spoke again, her voice more measured than before. Perhaps we have misunderstood you. The challenges we face as a species are so different from your own. The Zilkar have never had to fight for survival in the same way you do. We are built to endure. But your species, she hesitated. Your species creates. You are a force of nature unlike anything we've seen. Exorlan nodded slowly. We still don't fully understand your biology, Dr. Vance. But perhaps we don't need to. Ethan gave them a knowing smile. You don't need to. Just watch us, and you'll see that we don't need to be understood to thrive. We just need the chance to prove ourselves. The Zilkar remained quiet for a long moment, their minds clearly processing the profound shift in their perception of humanity. For the first time, they weren't afraid of what they didn't understand. Instead, they were beginning to see humanity not as a threat, but as a new and unpredictable force that could bring something completely new to the galaxy. Ethan's smile deepened as he stood to leave the room. So, what's next? Vrelek stood too, her expression contemplative. Perhaps we should start with a joint venture, a project that combines our knowledge and your creativity. There is much we can learn from each other. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. Now that is something I'm really interested in. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity aboard the station. The Zilkar, once wary of humanity's chaotic biology, had begun to engage with them in a way that had seemed impossible only days ago. No longer did they see humans as a species defined by unpredictability and oddity. They were now beginning to appreciate the opportunity that humanity represented. For Ethan Vance, this shift in perception was both exhilarating and terrifying. The Zilkar were not a people who quickly accepted new ideas. Their biological rigidity had once been their greatest strength, but now they were grappling with a new kind of strength, the human spirit of invention. The idea that humanity could adapt not just to survive, but to transform their environment, had sparked a powerful interest among the Zilkar leadership. It wasn't just in their dealings with Ethan or Captain Carter anymore. The Zilkar were meeting with human scientists, engineers, and even artists, exploring how human creativity could complement their own scientific advancements. But there was still tension in the air. Both sides were still unsure of what the future held, especially with the specter of the Galactic Council looming over them. Would the Council accept this unexpected alliance? Or would they see it as a disruption to the existing order? Ethan, however, was determined to see this through. As a scientist, he knew that humanity's most powerful tool wasn't its biology. It was its ability to collaborate, to bring together diverse minds to create something greater than the sum of their parts. And if there was one thing the Zilkar had learned from their recent experiences, it was that collaboration wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. A new proposal. The first joint project between humanity and the Zilkar was, predictably, a massive undertaking. Their two species had vastly different approaches to technology. Where the Zilkar had engineered their society around a strict framework of genetic optimization, humanity had thrived through a combination of ingenuity and diversity. The challenge was finding a way to merge those two methodologies. It all started with a bold proposal from Dr. Park, who had been working closely with the Zilkar's lead biologists. She suggested creating a new type of bioorganic material, one that would combine human ingenuity in engineering with the Zilkar's advanced understanding of biostructural design. The idea was to create a self-healing, energy-efficient material capable of adapting to various environmental conditions. At first, the Zilkar were skeptical. Their approach to technology had always been pragmatic and efficient, but the idea of adaptable technology, something that could change over time, was outside of their comfort zone. For the Zilkar, perfection was something static, something that didn't evolve. But as the project moved forward, they began to see the potential. Ethan found himself at the center of this collaborative effort, working with a Zilkar bioengineer named Zoklor, who was as fascinated by human creativity as Ethan was by Zilkar biology. They spent hours poring over research, discussing possibilities, and tweaking designs. What began as a small project soon evolved into something far greater. A prototype for a new kind of alloy, an alloy that could heal itself when damaged, adapt to temperature extremes, and even grow based on environmental needs. "We can make it work," Zoklor said one day, his mandibles twitching with excitement. "I've never seen anything like this before. Humans. You think in ways that defy logic yet always find solutions." Ethan smiled, proud but modest. "It's all about thinking outside the box. Or, in this case, thinking about the box changing over time." Soon, prototypes were being tested, first in small-scale environments, then in larger habitats. The first tests were astonishing. Plants could grow inside synthetic structures that healed when broken. Homes could adapt to fluctuating temperatures and shifting landscapes. The material was, in essence, living. As the collaboration deepened, so did the bond between the two species. The Zilkar, once isolated and cautious, now saw the potential in working alongside humanity. But there was still a question lingering over them. Could this alliance last? The Galactic Council conundrum. The true test came when the Zilkar and humans submitted their proposal to the Galactic Council. The Council, an ancient body of representatives from hundreds of species, was the final arbiter of all interspecies matters, and they were notoriously conservative. Ethan had learned long ago that the Council's decisions were rarely based on innovation. They favored stability and control. A radical alliance between two such fundamentally different species was bound to raise eyebrows. The day of the Council hearing arrived, and Ethan found himself standing alongside Vrilek and Exorlon in the Grand Chamber, surrounded by representatives of dozens of species. There were the hulking Shurthar, the elegant and cerebral Nvashi, and the enigmatic, shadowy Train, all sitting in judgment of the Zilkar's newfound partnership with humanity. As Vrilek began to present their joint proposal, Ethan felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew the stakes were high. The Zilkar had agreed to place their trust in humanity, but would the Galactic Council? The representative from the Shurthar, a towering figure covered in thick, armored plating, was the first to speak. "What exactly is the purpose of this alliance?" His deep voice echoed through the chamber. "Are you proposing that humans, chaotic as they are, have something to offer the galaxy beyond disruption?" Ethan stood tall, meeting the Shurthar's gaze without flinching. "We don't claim to have all the answers, but what we do have is the ability to adapt, to learn. And together, humanity and the Zilkar have created something truly revolutionary. Technology that heals itself, that adapts to new conditions, that could change the very nature of how we live." Another voice spoke up, this time from the Nvashi delegation. You would have us place our trust in this unpredictable species? You're asking us to stake the future of the galaxy on humans. Ethan met her gaze firmly. Yes, we are asking you to trust in us. Because no one else has. The silence that followed was heavy. The council deliberated, voices rising and falling as they debated the implications of such an alliance. The tension was almost unbearable, but after what seemed like an eternity, the Shurthar representative finally stood. It is done, he declared. We will allow this partnership to continue. A collective breath was released throughout the chamber. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, and for the first time, he allowed himself to smile. Vrilek and Exorlan exchanged a look of quiet triumph. The Zilkar had finally recognized what humanity had always known. We were more than just survivors, we were creators, innovators, and dreamers. And now, at long last, the galaxy would see the truth. The future wasn't about order or perfection. It was about growth, change, and endless possibilities. Ethan Vance walked out of the chamber with his head held high. The alliance had been accepted, but more importantly, humanity's place in the galaxy had been earned. The Zilkar had learned something vital from humanity, and now it was time for the galaxy to learn, too.